Stop right there. Keep your hands where I can see them.
My hands are visible. Why am I being stopped, officer?
I got a call about a suspect casing houses. You match the description.
What specific description? I am exercising on a public sidewalk.
I'm not doing this debate. Turn around. You're being detained.
I'm complying, but articulable facts are required for a terrorist.
Hands behind your back. Do it now.
The camera was already recording, not just sound, not just movement, but the sequence of decisions that would later be replayed frame by frame. At the moment the encounter began, the officer did not know that everything he was about to say and do would become evidence rather than narrative. He was operating inside a familiar routine, standing in a position of authority that rarely gets questioned in real time. The woman in front of him was engaged in an ordinary, lawful activity. According to the footage, nothing about the scene suggested urgency, danger, or criminal conduct. There was no attempt to flee, no concealment, no raised voice. The environment was stable. The officer's posture, however, communicated control. Commands were issued calmly, confidently, as if the outcome of the encounter were already assumed. What the officer did not know, and what the camera would later make unavoidable, was that the person he was asserting authority over had spent years on an appellate court reviewing the legality of police conduct. She had evaluated investigatory detentions, written opinions applying Fourth Amendment standards, and participated in decisions that shaped how lower courts assess exactly these kinds of encounters. Those facts were not announced. They were not visible, but they existed, and they mattered. This is where the dramatic irony begins. The footage captures an officer acting under the assumption that compliance would resolve the situation. It captures a civilian being treated as someone whose role was to submit first and clarify later. What it does not capture is awareness. Awareness that the woman being addressed had previously ruled on cases involving unlawful detention, excessive authority, and the limits of police discretion. Early in the encounter, there was an opportunity to disengage. The setting was routine. The activity was lawful. According to later filings, no warrant existed, no crime had been confirmed, and no new facts emerged to justify extending the interaction. But the officer did not step back. He continued forward, reinforcing control rather than reassessing it. That choice matters, not because of how it felt in the moment, but because of what followed. This encounter would not end with a warning or a brief explanation. It would trigger an internal investigation, the termination of an officer's employment, and a civil settlement measured in hundreds of thousands of dollars. Those consequences were not visible at the start, but they were already set in motion by the decision to proceed without recalibration. The camera does not editorialize. It does not exaggerate. It simply records the point at which authority is exercised and the point at which it begins to exceed its lawful limits. From that moment forward, the outcome would no longer be shaped by perception or intent. It would be shaped by what the footage showed when reviewed later, without urgency and without assumption. This was not a confrontation that escalated suddenly. It was a routine encounter that crossed the line quietly, one decision at a time. And once that line was crossed, there was no path back to ordinary. According to public records later reviewed during the investigation, the woman at the center of this encounter had built her career within the appellate system. For years, her professional responsibility had been to examine trial records, assess the legality of police conduct, and apply constitutional standards to determine whether authority had been exercised within lawful bounds. That role did not exempt her from being questioned by law enforcement. It did, however, establish a clear baseline. She understood precisely how lawful authority is defined and where its limits lie. On the day captured in the footage, her presence at the location was entirely lawful. The activity she was engaged in was routine and permitted. The video shows no attempt to conceal her actions, no evasive behavior, and no indicators that would typically elevate an encounter beyond a brief inquiry. She remains stationary. Her movements are deliberate and visible. Her tone, when she speaks, is measured and calm. What stands out most is not what she does, but what she does not do. She does not argue emotionally. She does not provoke. She does not refuse to comply with lawful instructions. Instead, she asks for clarification. She asks why she is being detained. She asks, what facts justify the officer's continued control? These questions are not confrontational. They mirror the same inquiries courts routinely ask when reviewing the legality of stops and detentions after the fact. From a constitutional perspective, these questions are significant. Fourth Amendment jurisprudence requires that a detention be supported by reasonable suspicion and that its scope and duration remain reasonably related to the circumstances that justified it. The footage shows no new facts emerging that would expand that scope. The woman's conduct remains consistent throughout the encounter. The environment remains stable. Nothing changes except the officer's level of control. Her professional background also explains her choice of words. She does not cite case names or legal jargon at length. She does not lecture. She simply asks for articulation. Courts have long held that asking an officer to explain the basis for detention is not obstruction. It is protected speech. The video shows her exercising that right without interfering physically or creating risk. Importantly, at this stage, the officer does not appear to know who she is professionally. She does not identify herself as a judge. She does not present credentials. The interaction unfolds exactly as it would for any civilian. That absence of recognition sharpens the legitimacy gap. On one side is an individual whose conduct is lawful and whose understanding of constitutional standards is extensive. On the other is an officer operating on an assumption that has not yet been supported by observable facts. As the encounter continues, that gap widens. The officer does not recalibrate in response to the lack of corroborating evidence. He does not articulate new grounds for detention. Instead, the interaction shifts toward compliance as an end in itself. From a legal standpoint, this is where problems begin to compound. Compliance does not create suspicion. Silence does not create suspicion. Assertion of rights does not create suspicion. Later filings would emphasize this point repeatedly. The woman's presence was lawful. Her actions were ordinary. Her questions were constitutionally protected. At no point, according to the record, did the officer identify a specific, articulable fact that would justify extending the detention. Each additional moment of control required justification. The footage does not show that justification being supplied. This is the essence of the legitimacy gap. Courts do not evaluate encounters based on intuition or discomfort. They evaluate them based on facts and standards. The woman's legitimacy was not abstract. It was grounded in what the camera shows: lawful presence, calm demeanor, and consistent behavior. The officer's authority, by contrast, required ongoing support. Without it, the legal foundation for continued control eroded with each passing second. The woman appears to recognize this immediately. Her questions are timed. She does not interrupt. She does not escalate. She waits for answers that do not come. That restraint would later matter when the encounter was reviewed by supervisors and attorneys who were not present at the scene and had no stake in preserving the officer's initial assumptions. This gap between what the law requires and what the encounter reflects is not dramatic in the moment. It does not announce itself. It accumulates quietly. Each unanswered question, each unarticulated reason adds weight to the record. By the time the encounter moves toward escalation, the foundation has already weakened. The significance of the woman's background is not that she expected special treatment. It is that she understood, in real time, how this interaction would look when replayed later. She knew that recordings do not care about tone or intent. They care about sequence and justification. That understanding shaped her conduct, but it did not protect her from what came next. The legitimacy gap was now fully formed. What remained was the officer's response to it. From the officer's perspective, the encounter unfolded inside a framework that had been reinforced through training and repetition. Patrol work emphasizes control of the scene, early assertion of authority, and minimizing uncertainty. These priorities are not unique to this department. They are standard across American policing. According to later internal summaries, officers are trained to establish command quickly and to maintain it until an encounter is resolved. Within that mindset, disengagement can feel counterintuitive, even when circumstances warrant it. Nothing in the footage suggests the officer began the interaction intending to violate policy. His movements are deliberate. His tone remains even. There is no visible panic or confusion. This matters because it frames what follows not as a reaction to chaos, but as a sequence of decisions made under stable conditions. The environment is controlled. Visibility is clear. There are no external pressures forcing rapid escalation. Departmental culture plays a role in how such decisions are made. Officers are often evaluated not only on outcomes, but on how decisively they act. According to materials later referenced in the review process, hesitation can be interpreted as uncertainty, and uncertainty can be perceived as a safety risk. Over time, this can create an implicit expectation that once authority is asserted, it should be carried through to a definitive conclusion. The officer's experience level, as later noted in official documents, placed him in the middle of his career. He was neither new nor nearing retirement. Officers at this stage tend to rely on routine. They have conducted hundreds of similar encounters that ended without scrutiny. That familiarity can reinforce confidence in judgment, even when the factual basis for that judgment begins to erode. Reassessment is a core legal requirement, but it competes with operational instincts. Training materials emphasize that reasonable suspicion must be continuously evaluated and that detentions must be shortened or ended when justification disappears. In practice, however, reassessment requires an officer to reverse course publicly. That can feel like a loss of control, particularly in front of a civilian who is calmly questioning authority. The footage captures this tension. As the woman asks for clarification, the officer does not respond by articulating new facts. Instead, his commands become more directive. This is a common pattern identified in internal affairs reviews. Questions from civilians are sometimes perceived as challenges, even when they are legally protected. That perception does not appear in policy language, but it influences behavior on the street. The department had policies governing prolonged detentions and the use of restraints. Those policies, later summarized in public filings, require officers to articulate specific reasons for escalation and to disengage when those reasons no longer exist. Supervisory review is designed to enforce these standards after the fact. In this case, no supervisor was present during the encounter. The officer's judgment was the sole filter between policy and practice. This autonomy is inherent to patrol work. Officers are expected to make legal determinations without immediate consultation. That independence is necessary, but it also creates risk. When an officer misjudges a situation, there may be no corrective mechanism until the encounter has already escalated. By then, the options narrow. The footage does not show a moment where the officer pauses to reassess. There is no visible recalibration based on the woman's explanations or the absence of corroborating evidence. Instead, the interaction progresses toward greater control. Each instruction builds on the previous one, reinforcing a course of action that becomes harder to abandon with each step. Importantly, none of this analysis requires speculation about motive. The record does not establish animus or intent. It establishes a pattern consistent with other reviewed cases, an initial assumption, followed by incremental escalation, reinforced by training and culture that prioritize control over disengagement. Courts do not require proof of bad intent to find a constitutional violation. They require an examination of objective reasonableness. This context explains how an encounter that begins routinely can evolve into a legal problem without a dramatic trigger. The escalation is gradual. It is procedural. It unfolds in an environment where stopping feels riskier than continuing. By the time the consequences become apparent, the path has already been chosen. That dynamic sets the stage for the incident itself, where each additional decision increases legal exposure and reduces the possibility of reversal. The escalation does not arrive with a sudden command or a raised voice. It builds incrementally, decision by decision, in a way that feels procedural in the moment but becomes unmistakable in review. The footage shows the officer extending the encounter beyond its initial purpose without articulating new facts. What begins as a brief inquiry gradually takes on the characteristics of a detention. The first clear decision point occurs when the officer treats the interaction as no longer voluntary. His language shifts from inquiry to instruction. According to Fourth Amendment standards, this shift matters. A voluntary encounter allows a person to disengage. A detention does not. The footage does not show the officer explaining what new information justified that transition. This was a moment where the encounter could have ended. It did not. As time passes, the officer continues to issue commands without narrowing their scope. The woman remains calm and stationary. She asks why she is being detained and what facts support it. These questions are legally significant. Courts have consistently held that a detention must be supported by specific, articulable facts. The video shows none being offered. This is the second decision point. The officer could have reassessed. He did not. The interaction tightens further when the officer frames the woman's questions as non-compliance. This reframing is subtle but consequential. The footage captures her complying physically while asserting her rights verbally. Under established law, Verbal assertion does not constitute obstruction. Treating it as such marks another escalation. This was another chance to stop. It was not taken. The third decision point emerges when the officer introduces the possibility of restraint. Department policy later cited in the record limits handcuffing to situations involving safety concerns or flight risk. Neither is visible on camera. The woman's hands are in view. Her movements are deliberate. She does not attempt to leave. Despite this, the officer closes distance and positions himself for control. The legal stakes rise immediately. A brief pause follows. It lasts only seconds, but it is distinct. The environment remains unchanged. The woman stands still. The officer hesitates. This pause represents a narrowing window. At this moment, disengagement was still possible. The officer could have clarified authority, de-escalated, or ended the encounter. He proceeds instead. When the officer applies physical restraint, the escalation becomes irreversible. Handcuffing transforms the encounter into a seizure that demands justification. According to later court documents, this decision became central to the case. The cuffs are applied without resistance. There is no struggle, no sudden movement. The absence of chaos underscores the nature of the decision. It was not reactive. It was deliberate. From here, the pathway is fixed. Once restraints are applied, the officer's options contract sharply. Releasing the woman would require acknowledging error. Continuing forward shifts the encounter into formal detention. The footage shows the officer choosing continuation. This is the fourth decision point, and it carries the greatest legal weight. The woman's demeanor does not change. She does not argue. She does not plead. She complies physically while continuing to ask questions that remain unanswered. Her conduct remains consistent with the beginning of the encounter. The only variable that has changed is the level of authority being exercised over her. This pattern, lawful behavior met with escalating control, becomes the defining feature of the footage. Each step is small when viewed in isolation. Together, they form a chain. Courts do not evaluate these moments individually. They evaluate the totality. In that totality, each missed opportunity to disengage matters. As the officer proceeds, he still does not know who the woman is professionally. He has not verified credentials. He has not identified a crime. He is operating on momentum rather than information. The camera records this without commentary. It preserves the sequence exactly as it unfolds. The escalation does not produce disorder. It produces record. Every command, every pause, every unarticulated justification is captured. What might have felt routine in the moment becomes extraordinary in review. The footage will later be examined not for tone or demeanor, but for legal sufficiency. By the end of this sequence, the encounter has crossed from discretionary judgment into documented violation. The officer has committed to a course that will be evaluated by supervisors, attorneys, and courts applying standards he was trained to enforce himself. This is the point of no return. The authority dynamic has shifted irreversibly. What remains is not a question of perception, but of consequence, determined not on the street, but in the rooms where footage is reviewed without urgency and without assumption. Once the encounter moved into formal detention, the outcome was no longer governed by perception or intent. It became governed by evidence. According to later filings, the first step in that process was the preservation and review of the footage itself. The recording provided a continuous account of the encounter from start to finish, without gaps that required reconstruction or inference. Every command, every pause, and every shift in posture was available for review. Supervisors examined the video alongside dispatch records to determine the basis for the initial contact. According to official summaries, the information that prompted the officer's approach did not allege a specific crime in progress. It did not identify a suspect wanted in connection with an offense. There was no warrant associated with the woman, and no alert linking her to criminal activity. These facts established the starting point for evaluating the officer's authority. The review then turned to the duration and scope of the encounter. Investigators assessed whether new information emerged that would justify extending the interaction beyond a brief inquiry. The footage showed none. The woman's behavior remained consistent. The environment remained stable. No additional facts were articulated on camera to support continued detention. This absence became as significant as any action taken. As the investigation progressed, the woman's professional status was confirmed through documentation. credentials were verified, employment records were reviewed. This confirmation did not alter the facts of the encounter. It altered the clarity with which those facts were understood. Reviewers now recognized that the person restrained had spent years applying the same constitutional standards to other cases. The symmetry was unmistakable. There is a point during internal review where the analysis shifts from exploratory to conclusive. According to those familiar with the process, it occurs when the footage is viewed in silence, without commentary, and compared directly to policy language. The room grows quiet. No one offers alternative interpretations. The sequence speaks for itself. This is the midpoint collapse, not dramatic, but decisive. Internal Affairs initiated a formal inquiry. Investigators documented each stage of the encounter, linking specific actions to departmental policy and constitutional requirements. They noted the absence of articulated reasonable suspicion, the escalation without new facts, and the application of restraints without observable risk factors. Each finding was anchored to a timestamp. Subjective explanations were secondary to what the recording showed. The officer was interviewed and provided an account of his decision-making. That account was compared to the footage. Where the two diverged, the recording controlled. This is standard procedure. The purpose is not to assess intent, but to determine whether actions align with objective standards. In this case, the alignment was lacking. As the inquiry advanced, the matter was referred to the city's legal department. Attorneys evaluated potential exposure under federal civil rights statutes. The analysis focused on whether a reasonable officer, under the same circumstances, would have believed the detention and restraint were lawful. The footage became the central exhibit. Its clarity narrowed the range of defensible arguments. At this stage, the investigation was no longer about uncertainty. It was about consequence. The evidence did not escalate, it consolidated. Each additional review confirmed the same conclusion. The encounter extended beyond its lawful basis, and the escalation was unsupported by documented facts. The authority dynamic had fully reversed. The officer, once the decision-maker, was now the subject of review. His actions were measured against standards he was trained to apply. The woman, once restrained, was now represented by a record that required no interpretation. By the time the investigation reached its final phase, the remaining questions were procedural rather than factual. What discipline was appropriate? What liability did the city face? What corrective measures would follow? Those questions would be answered in sequence, guided not by emotion or public reaction, but by the documented facts preserved on camera. Once the investigation reached its conclusion, the outcomes followed a predictable legal sequence. According to official records, the first determination addressed the officer's employment status. The internal review found that the prolonged detention and use of restraints were not supported by specific, articulable facts consistent with departmental policy or constitutional standards. The findings were tied directly to the footage, with references to precise moments where justification was required and not provided. The officer was placed on administrative leave while the disciplinary process moved forward. When the final decision was issued, it cited multiple policy violations, including extending a detention without reasonable suspicion and escalating control without observable safety concerns. These conclusions did not rely on interpretations of intent or demeanor. They relied on what the recording showed and what it did not show. Termination followed shortly thereafter, documented as a for-cause separation. In parallel, the city's legal exposure was evaluated. According to court filings, counsel assessed potential claims under federal civil rights law, focusing on unlawful seizure and arrest. The standard applied was objective reasonableness. Whether a reasonable officer, in the same circumstances, would have believed the actions taken were lawful. The footage served as the factual baseline for that analysis, limiting the range of defensible arguments. A civil lawsuit was filed soon after. The complaint laid out the sequence of events captured on camera, cross-referenced with departmental policy, and established Fourth Amendment precedent. It did not allege motive as a necessary element. Instead, it argued that the actions themselves exceeded constitutional limits. The filing cited specific timestamps, transforming the video into a structured evidentiary record. As the case progressed, settlement discussions began. According to disclosures made later, the city evaluated the likelihood of prevailing at trial in light of the evidence. The clarity and continuity of the footage were decisive factors. There were no conflicting witness accounts to reconcile and no missing recordings to explain. Based on that assessment, the city agreed to resolve the matter through a financial settlement in the amount of $910,000, a figure confirmed in public records. The settlement was reached without an admission of wrongdoing, consistent with standard municipal practice. However, the agreement included additional provisions beyond monetary compensation. According to the settlement terms, the department committed to reviewing and updating training related to investigatory detentions and the use of restraints. These provisions were directly tied to the deficiencies identified in the case. External oversight also took notice. While no criminal charges were filed, federal authorities reviewed the incident to determine whether broader compliance issues warranted attention. According to public statements, the review focused on policy and training rather than individual culpability. No further enforcement action was announced at that stage, but the scrutiny underscored the significance of the case. For the officer, the consequences were definitive. Termination for cause effectively ended his law enforcement career. Appeals were available under collective bargaining agreements, but according to later reports, those efforts did not result in reinstatement. The findings were too closely aligned with the recorded evidence to support reversal. For the city, the settlement became part of its public liability record. Financial payouts of this scale are tracked and analyzed, influencing insurance costs, training priorities, and policy reviews. Each settlement represents not only compensation, but an acknowledgement that procedural safeguards failed in practice. The legal consequences unfolded without spectacle. There was no dramatic courtroom moment and no disputed verdict. The process moved steadily from investigation to discipline to resolution, guided by documentation rather than narrative. By the time the settlement was finalized, the outcome was no longer contested internally. The record had resolved it. What remained was the broader question of how the system would respond to the evidence it had been forced to confront. The consequences of this case did not end with a termination notice or a settlement check. Once the footage became part of the public and administrative record, the department was compelled to address the broader implications of what it revealed. According to post-incident summaries, the focus shifted from the actions of one officer to the systems that allowed the encounter to unfold without interruption. Training protocols were revised to emphasize a principle long established in constitutional law, but inconsistently applied in practice. Authority must be reassessed continuously. Officers were instructed that investigatory detentions are not static and that the absence of new, articulable facts requires disengagement rather than persistence. The use of restraints received particular scrutiny. Handcuffing was reframed as a measure requiring clear justification tied to safety or flight risk, not as a default response to perceived noncompliance. Supervisory review processes were also adjusted. Encounters involving extended detentions or restraints without documented justification were flagged for secondary evaluation. According to internal guidance later made public, the goal was early intervention, identifying patterns before they hardened into routine behavior. Data systems were recalibrated to track escalation trends, allowing supervisors to intervene based on behavior rather than outcomes alone. At the municipal level, the settlement prompted a reassessment of liability management. City officials acknowledged that cases resolved through clear video evidence represent failures with costs that extend beyond financial loss. Each incident diverts resources, erodes public confidence, and exposes gaps between policy and practice. In response, the city expanded audits of stop and detention data, focusing on consistency with constitutional standards rather than the number of enforcement actions taken. The footage itself assumed an educational role. According to reports, segments were incorporated into training sessions and legal discussions as a case study in how ordinary encounters can cross constitutional lines without overt misconduct. Its value was not in dramatics, but in precision. It demonstrated how a sequence of routine decisions, unexamined in the moment, can culminate in significant legal consequences when reviewed later. What makes this case enduring is not the professional status of the individual involved, but the inevitability of the outcome once the encounter was documented. The woman possessed legal knowledge, institutional access, and representation. Even with those advantages, the encounter escalated. The difference was not protection in real time, but accountability afterward. For individuals without those advantages, similar encounters often pass without review. There is no internal investigation, no settlement, no policy revision. In this case, the camera removed ambiguity. It preserved the facts exactly as they occurred, allowing the system to respond based on evidence rather than assumption. This is not a story about intent or character. It is a record of how authority functions when unchecked and how it can be corrected when documentation makes deviation undeniable. The footage remains unchanged. It continues to show the moment authority exceeded its limits and the process that followed when that moment could no longer be explained away.